All right, so welcome everybody to this first event of the Festival of Social Sciences, Society from Your Sofa. So welcome to this first session, Experiments for the Social Good. Just a few announcements, so you can ask questions in the Q&A section, and we will come back to these questions at the very end of the event. If you want to tweet about the event, there's a hashtag, ESRC Festival. There's many other nice events in this festival. If you go to festivalofsocialscience.com, you can find out about these other events. So what's happening today? So today, we're going to be talking about experiments, and I wanted to let you know a little bit about who we are. So we are researchers at the economics department here at the University of Birmingham, and we're all members of BEATS. So BEATS is the Behavioral, Experimental and Data Science Network at the business school. We use economic experiments to understand a little bit better how people make decisions about their health, their wealth, and their climate. So today we're going to be 4 speakers. So first of all, it's going to be Professor Kim Scharf. So she's an expert in the economics of charitable giving, and she's been using experiment to understand why people give to charities, how charities can raise higher incomes, and how human altruism actually works. Then there's going to be Dr. Rebecca McDonald. Dr. Rebecca McDonald has worked extensively on questions of patience. So what happens if some rewards are delayed and happen later than the cost of these rewards? And then also she spent a lot of time understanding how people value their own health and how they might value their own life. Then there's going to be Dr. Danae Arroyos-Calvera, and she's also studying human altruism. And together with Rebecca, she's also studying questions about human health and human life and how we can attach values to these. And then at the very last is going to be myself. So I'm Dr. Johannes Lohse. I've been studying human cooperation and then applying these insights to questions of climate change. So what's going to happen today? So first of all, I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction, experiments in economics, but why? The second part of the whole event is going to be an interactive session where we will ask you to take part in 3 short experiments so you can see how experiments work in economics and what we might be able to learn from them. And then we're going to be closing the event with 3 short research talks. So first of all, we're going to have Rebecca and Danae having a conversation about experimental economics and what that might tell us about COVID-19 and the current situation. Then I will be talking a little bit about my own research, how it is so hard to cooperate for the climate. And then finally, Kim will tell us a little bit more about how we can use experiments to understand more about charitable giving and fundraising. So experiments in economics, but why? So if you think about an experiment, you might think back about experiments in natural sciences and what you might have been doing at school. And these experiments often look a little bit like that, right?
Real quick, come back up.
And this is not...
Is your elephant?
That's not really what we have in mind when we think about an experiment in economics. So if you think about an experiment in economics, then often there could be, in the beginning, there could be a question. And the question that might be interesting to economists and that might be interesting to yourselves is, so do people actually save more for their own retirement if this requires them to make an active choice? So how to find out more about this question? And the first thing that experiments do is they use a randomization device, right? And here we have some dice. And these dice might decide whether people are allocated to a baseline. And in this particular kind of experiment, the baseline could be that there's no default. So basically, there's no default that you have to save for your retirement. Or you could land up in a treatment condition where there is such default. So this is not just an abstract example. This is an actual experiment that people have run. So they went into firms, and then these firms had 401k plans. So a 401k plan is a retirement plan. So for these baseline people where there was no default, they basically had to actively sign up for this 401k plan. If you compare that to the treatment condition, the default was that people, when they joined the firm, they were signed up to this 401k plan automatically, unless they basically decided against this actively. So what's the difference between these two things? People are thinking about their retirement. And in this baseline, 30% of people end up saving retirement through a 401k plan offered by their firm, while 85% of people do that if they end up in a treatment condition. So this is just an illustration how, first of all, experiments work, but then also how they can lead to very different outcomes for people. Seems like a minor tweak, but actually leads to very different outcomes. So if you think about experiments in economics, you might wonder, have economists always used experiments in their research? And if you go back in history and start with John Stuart Mill, a classical economist, he was basically very, very much adamant that you couldn't really use experiments in a moral science, or moral science is something that we might be calling a social science today, right? So he's saying, well, there's experiments in the physical sciences, but there's seldom the possibility to do experiments in a moral science. So if you go to a little bit more recent times, you have Milton Friedman here, also a very famous economist, and he's basically saying, again, the same sentiment, right? So he's basically expressing the sentiment that you can't really do experiments well in the social sciences, but he's also giving you a reason why it would be nice to use these experiments, because you could basically use experiments to maybe eliminate what are judged to be the most important disturbing influences. And then if you go to the UK and listen to Joan Robinson, so she's saying basically, economists cannot make use of controlled experiments to settle their differences. They have to appeal to historical evidence. So is all of this really true? Depends on the question you would like to ask. So if you have some very big macro questions in mind, and if you think economists are mainly concerned with these big macro questions, then it might be really hard or even impossible to run experiments, right? So if you wonder whether Brexit is a good idea, well, hopefully many of us can agree that's probably not a good idea, but it's impossible to test this in an experiment. Why? Well, you can't really run an experiment where you randomly keep the UK out of the EU and keep it in at the same time. It's just not possible. And even if you go to a question about climate change, so is the Paris Agreement, the big agreement on climate change, really working? Well, it would be really hard to run an experiment on that where you randomly assign countries to sign the Paris Agreement. Well, this is not really possible as well. And even if you could, what would happen? Well, you would assign some of these countries to the Paris Agreement and some not, and there will be spillover, meaning that even the assigned countries will influence what happens in the non-assigned countries. So if you are concerned with these big macro questions, then these earlier sentiments about experiments in economics might actually be quite true. However, if you think about questions that economists really care about as well, and that's mainly micro questions, well, these questions can often be answered through careful experiments. And you have two types of experiments. So you have a type of experiment that's called a field experiment, and that's really concerned with policy applications or concrete settings. So you stay in the setting of a school, or you stay in the setting of a firm, and you want to understand how people within the setting change their behavior if you run an experiment on that they're mostly not even aware of. So some questions that could be interesting. So if you wanted to find out whether extra tutoring actually changes student outcomes, you could go to a university like the University of Birmingham, and then you could give extra tutoring to some students and not to others. You randomly assign this extra tutoring, and then you could look at student outcomes and find out how well students are doing. Or if you wanted to find out whether people give more to charities, if they have more information on these charities, well, then you could assign again people on different websites. On some websites, there's more information, on others, there's less information. And then you could look at their giving behavior, even though these people are not even aware that they're part of an experiment, right? So this is field experiments. So they're mostly concerned with concrete applications. You could also think about lab experiments that we often do. So lab experiments look a little bit like a computer lab, right? And you sit people at these computers, and then you let them do some decision tasks. And from these decision tasks, we might learn something about their motivations, right? So for example, if you think about Rebecca's research, you might want to find out in which way people trade off early and later rewards. And you can do that by giving them tasks where they do exactly these trade-offs, and you can observe whether people delay gratification or whether people basically don't look that far into the future. Or if I think about my own research, you could be interested in whether people are more likely to cooperate in larger or in smaller groups. And this is a setting you can replicate in these computer tasks and see what people do. So the last thing I want to talk about a little bit before we go into the interactive session is, so what's so great about experiments in the first place? Look at this graph for a second. So this graph shows you two things. It shows you the divorce rate in Maine, and it shows you the per capita consumption of margarine. And you can see here that it says, well, the divorce rate in Maine correlates with the per capita consumption of margarine at 99.26%. And that's a very, very high correlation. So it basically means these two time trends move very closely in parallel. However, it might be very dangerous to conclude from looking at that there's an actual relationship between these. So this is looking at historical data like Joan Robinson suggested economists should do. However, the question is whether we really learn something about the main relationship we want to find out. Is it really true that these two things correlate? It looks a little bit strange, right? So how could we use an experiment to learn a little bit more about this? If we want to disentangle something that is called a correlation, so the co-movement of two timelines, from causality, so whether really the per capita consumption of margarine causes the divorce rate to change in Maine. And the way you could find it out in an experiment is the same way I've shown you before. So you have a randomization device, and then you put some people into a baseline condition, and you suggest to them to only eat 1 box of margarine per month. And then you put people into a treatment condition and you suggest to them to eat 3 boxes of margarine per month. And that should basically tell you whether there's a causal relationship between these two things. And that's the great power of experiments, that you're really able to separate correlation from causality. Obviously, you can apply that to more serious research as well. So if you really wondered whether the availability of health insurance might improve health outcomes, then you might really have a problem if you look at observational data. Why? Because there might be selection effects. What do we mean by selection effects? Well, people who might be in really poor health will be more likely to buy insurance, right? And if they do so, and you look at the data, it will look like health insurance actually makes people sick. And that would be a completely wrong conclusion, maybe. So what you would instead want to do if you were running an experiment, you would like to give insurance to random people, and that again would show if there's a true effect of being insured or not, if you don't run into these selection effect problems. So the title of the whole event today is Experiments for the Social Good. So what can we really learn from all these exercises in experimental economics that have been happening for the last 20 to 30 years? And here's just a few examples where we think that experiments actually have helped the social good. One of the insights is that defaults matter, right? So if you look at these two numbers, this is the number of registered organ donors in Denmark and Sweden. And you can see that in Denmark, 4.25% of the population have registered to be an organ donor. But in Sweden, 85.9% of the population has registered to be an organ donor. So this is a huge difference. So where does this huge difference come from? It comes from a simple default effect. The simple default effect is that you are by construction an organ donor in Sweden unless you opt out, while in Denmark, by construction, you're not an organ donor, you have to opt in. Right, and this simple difference has led to very different organ donation rates. And so governments around Europe have been thinking about how to change rules about this to get closer to a place like Sweden and further away from a place like Denmark, because we want more people to register as organ donors. Another thing that might not be too surprising to some of you is that social norms really matter. So we really care to comply with behavior that seems to be common to us. And how did people find that out, or what's an application of that? So many hotels in a hotel chain wanted to actually reduce their environmental impact. The first thing they did is they basically appealed to people and were putting on labels and were saying, well, it's really, really bad if you wash these towels every day. It's bad for the environment. Please don't do that. But people were not really listening to this message. When they changed the message to saying, well, most people in this hotel actually don't basically wash this towel every day, that increased basically the recycling of these hotel towels using them more than one day from 35 to 44%. Another insight that comes from experiment is that these pro-social motives, so people care about being altruists, really matter sometimes. So if you think about the question of blood donation, well, sometimes you get small rewards if you're a blood donor, but if these rewards get too small, they might crowd out an intrinsic motivation to be a blood donor. So people like to be altruists, but if you tell them, look, you can have £2 if you give your blood, that might actually be crowding out these altruistic motivations, but not give people enough motivation to become a blood donor. So that might backfire. If you give people larger rewards, that might override these altruistic incentives, and you might get donors that way as well. Right, so this is just like a warning that if you sometimes think you can give people smaller rewards, that might backfire if they might also have pro-social motives. Another insight is that all of us are cognitive misers. So what this means is that small cognitive efforts can be large obstacles sometimes. So if you have a government program that you want to implement, and that involves filling out a lot of forms, then people might simply not fill out these forms. So there's great experiments that show that even having somebody come to your house, filling this form with you, and then leaving a little envelope on your table and telling you all you have to do is put this envelope into a post box and post it, and you will get free money, basically, of around $5,000. A lot of people didn't do it. So even these small cognitive efforts of having to remember to post a letter can be a large obstacle to some people. And the last thing that comes out of experiments, and this is just a list of examples, there are many more examples out there, obviously, social image concerns matter as well as very much to people. So they care about how other people perceive them. And so being observed often reduces misbehavior. And this is even true if you simply put up a poster where there's some eyes on there. So this is something that comes from the crime literature, right? So they have put up these posters in some areas and realized that people are less inclined to behave in a criminal manner if these posters were up. So experiments are an elegant solution to distinguish between correlation from causality. And it's no surprise that 3 recent Nobel Prizes in economics actually were awarded in the areas of behavioral and experimental economics. So you have Bob Taylor here, you have Esther Duflo, Michael Kramer, and Abhijit Banerjee in the middle, and then you have Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman on the right. All of them are famous figures in behavioral economics, and their research has really been well received. So this has been a short introduction on what experiments really can do for economics, what we can learn from them. And what we want to invite you to do now is to take part in some short experiments and really see how these things work. So these will be experiments where you make decisions about health, where you make decisions about cooperation, and where you make decisions about giving. And then we will come back to these experiments in our research talks a little bit, because they will be about similar topics. So how will this work out? So first of all, you are supposed to click on the link that will be shortly shared in your chat window. And then a new window will open up in your browser. And in this window, you will get some instructions that you can simply follow. And while you're reading these instructions, there will be some music playing. So all of this will take around 3 minutes. After the music stops, or when you're finished with the instructions and making a decision, just return to Zoom. And for 2 of these 3 experiments, there will also be a little prize draw. So you can win a prize if you want to. So if you want to win this prize, you'll have to leave an email address with us, and then we will get in touch with you after the event. So we'll be starting experiment 1 in a second, and my colleague Rebecca will start sharing her screen and will instruct you further.
Okay, so you should be able to see in the chat window the link to the experiment. I'll not say more, but I'll just let you get started. And you've got 3 minutes starting from now.
All right, so many of you have now finished submitting some answers to this very first short experiment, and my colleague is just collating the data so that we can show you what actually happened there. If my colleague just could change one to the next slide. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a little bit of a broader context of what you've been doing here. So experiments like this are used to understand how people make trade-offs involving saving lives. So this is very close to some research by people who run a website called moralmachine.net. So this website is used to understand how people think about AI and self-driving cars and whom they would save and whom they would not save. So this research is also used by my colleagues Rebecca and Danae to understand how people make certain trade-offs, for example, between their own money against their safety, or how they would like to save most lives versus treating different groups fairly. And studies like these have shown, for example, that people care about other safety, maybe not surprisingly. They value reducing risks of dying sooner more highly than later, and they tend to prioritize safety for children and the vulnerable. So these are just some of the results that can come out of research like that. So what we want to find out now is what happened with you guys. So we want to have a look at how you've decided in this experiment. So I don't know whether we're already ready to show you some graphs of that. Maybe we're gonna need a little bit longer. Okay, there seems to be a little bit of a problem. So we might come back to experiment 1 later on, and might have to talk about, or might have to get you to do experiment 2 first. So my colleague Danae has now shared a link with you for experiment 2. And the music should start playing in a second. Okay, so most of you should have now finished with the second experiment. So this is also a classical experiment in experimental economics. It's called a public goods experiment. So what are public goods? So public goods are goods that benefit everyone, no matter whether they contribute to the production or provision of these goods or not. So an example that is easily understandable is air quality, right? Air quality is a good that we all enjoy, and we can all contribute to improving air quality, but even if we don't contribute to improving air quality, we might benefit from cleaner air around us. And in these public goods, there's an inherent tension between enjoying the benefits of the public good and free riding on the contributions of other people that could be providing these public goods. And there's two important classes of these public goods. The first class is what is called a local public good. So a local public good could be a nice park here somewhere in Birmingham that is open access. It could also be a fireworks display somewhere in New Year's time. And obviously, all people can benefit from the provision of these local public goods. But the good thing is, even if people will try to free ride on these, there can be government provision. So government provision might mean that the government can basically tax people and then decide to provide these public goods for them, even when they fall in this inherent tension where they can't enjoy these benefits without free riding on the contributions of others. On the other hand, there's these global public goods. So global public goods are public goods that are enjoyed by all people around the globe. So climate change is one of these global public goods that I will be talking about later on. Controlling a global pandemic is another of these global public goods that Danae and Rebecca will be talking about later on. The problem is that internationally, we don't have these institutions in place. And so here we really have to rely on voluntary cooperation. But the question is, would people actually be motivated enough to voluntarily cooperate? And this is one of the questions that we can find out by careful experiments. So what we want to show you now is basically how this public goods experiment that we've been doing with you has actually been working. So my colleague will now switch to the next slide, and that will show you basically whether people are sufficiently cooperative, or in fact, whether you've been sufficiently cooperative in this experiment we've been doing with you. So that's basically a distribution of contributions. So most of you have been in this experiment, and you could basically contribute anywhere between 0 and £4 to the provision of a public good. So the rules of this game that you've been playing are such that 0 contributions maximize the earning of a participant. You can see that quite a few participants actually decided to contribute 0, and that would be the prediction of any standard economic model that says, well, most people might care only about their own earnings. But you can see a second peak here in the data, and the second peak in this data is at £4. So this is basically the kind of contribution that people make if they want to benefit this group by contributing everything. So that's quite a standard way of things, how things look in these experiments. It's a little bit surprising that we can't see a peak at 2, which would normally be the third common thing that people do in this kind of experiment. So you can see that there's typically 2 groups of people in these kinds of experiments, so cooperators and free riders. And another thing I wanted to illustrate with the second experiment is basically that we can test some treatment effects in experiments. So when we move on to the next thing, this was an experiment on framing. So what do we mean by framing? So without you knowing, we have randomized you to a baseline group or a treatment group. In the baseline group, people were asked to contribute to the public good. In the treatment group, there was just a slight change of wording, and that's what we mean by framing, where people were asked whether they would like to withdraw an amount from the public good. So what's the underlying question of something like that? So there might be a difference between maintaining an existing good that has already been provided, but people can withdraw from, or creating a new one. Creating a new one, alone from the wording, might sound a little bit more like this contribution problem here, while withdrawing from the public good might look a little bit more like this maintenance problem. So let's have a look whether this framing had any effect on you in this little experiment we did with you. And you can see that the average contributions in this contribution framework are much higher than the average contributions in this withdrawal framework. And that's interesting, right? Because it was only a change in wording that made you do different things in this experiment. And we haven't run any statistical test on this, but I would be fairly confident that this might even be a significant difference between the two things. Another nice thing about experiments is that you can try to replicate earlier work by other people, and that's exactly what we've been trying to do here. So there's a paper by Kölle et al. From 2017 that looks at exactly this difference in framing and finds exactly the same thing that we did find with you guys in this second experiment. And I think this is quite nice to see that you can actually run the same experiment and get a very similar result. So we now move on to the third and last part of this interactive part of our talk. Oh, okay, we go back to experiment 1. So apparently we could actually create some data for experiment 1 now. So if you remember what you did in experiment 1, you had to state some priorities over whom you would like to give a hospital bed, right? And you have here 3 age groups, right? You have the age group 20 to 60-year-olds, you have the age group 60 plus, and you have the age group younger than 20. And you can see that in this age group 20 to 60-year-olds, there's quite a strong difference between prioritizing the person over 60 or prioritizing this person under 20, with some preference giving for this person under 20, while for these other age groups, this difference is smaller or not even there at all. So what health group do people want to prioritize? And again, split by whether they themselves are in poor health, neither in poor nor great health, or in great health. And you can see that generally people tend to prioritize ill people over healthy people, which might be a natural inclination. But this difference is easier to make if you yourself are in great health. So that's just, to see what you actually did in this first experiment. We had a little bit of a problem with the data collection, but now it seems to be fine. Okay, so let's move on to this last third experiment now. And this last third experiment, again, we'll start with a link shared with you in the chat. You click on the link, you will make some decisions, and then I will give you some short explanation of what you just did before we move into the individual research talks. All right, so most of you will have submitted some answers to this third and last online experiment that we were doing with you. So in a second, I will explain a little bit to you what this experiment was about. So this was an experiment about altruism or charitable giving. So first of all, you had to pick options here, right? And there were two types of options, you could say. So one option was the self-serving option. So that simply means you would get a higher reward for yourself and then a lower reward for your picked charity. And then there might be the other regarding option, which simply means a lower reward for yourself and a higher reward for the charity that you picked. And again, we did a little experiment on you guys, and this is an experiment on a phenomenon called the moral wiggle room. And the moral wiggle room phenomenon basically puts you either in a condition where both of these options, the self-serving and the other regarding option, had some transparent payoffs, right? So these transparent payoffs mean you could see what both of these options mean for the charity. In the treatment condition, the only change to this baseline was that we have the payoffs in transparent, right? But you had an option to learn. So in a sense, both baseline and treatment are very similar. All you had to do in the treatment was basically click on a button, learn. And the question in these moral wiggle room experiments is simply, do people maybe hide a little bit behind in transparency in a self-serving manner? So if you think about clothes shopping, you go to a clothes shop, right? And you might not want to find out how the t-shirt was produced, because otherwise you might not want to buy this t-shirt anymore. But if you don't know, you feel much more confident buying this shirt that might have been produced in by child labor or in not so good conditions. So let's have a look what happened with you guys in this kind of experiment. So did hiding behind information actually affect your giving in this study? So do we have a graph yet, Rebecca?
Nearly.
Very good. So you can see that everything is being live produced on the other side. So it might take another minute or two. So what basically happens on the other side, so Rebecca had to download all the data and then put them through a statistics software just to show you what happened. And this is a little bit of a surprising result in the sense, if you look at this literature on moral wiggle room, and maybe Rebecca or Danae have some comments on that. So first of all, we would typically assume that more people don't want to find out. So in this sample of you guys, only 10% of people avoided information. So typically you'd see information avoidance of around 50% of people. So that basically is a non-typical result. If you compare sharing by treatment, we don't see any difference. And again, that's quite a non-typical result. So here we see also very high rates of sharing. So most of you wanted to give the higher amount to the charity. So the last thing we can look at, and that's a little bit more typical. So people who are basically selected to be informed were very eager to share most of this money with the charity, while those people who didn't really want to know, and that's a little bit of this exploitation of the moral wiggle room, actually exploited not knowing, but that's only 10% of the people, but they exploited not knowing anything about the options by maybe not taking the option that is better for the charity and instead taking the option that is better for themselves. So we see a little bit of a moral wiggle room story going on here, but in other samples, the story has been much more extreme. So there was a question in the chat of how many respondents we had. So that's something Rebecca knows, but I don't.
The data is about 80 participants.
Okay, so that's data from 80 people. Okay, so just switching to the last slide. So what is this all about? So we know a little bit that the humans are reluctant altruists. So most of us like to be nice some of the time, but hardly all of us want to be altruists all of the time, right? And sometimes it's also better to look like an altruist to other people or to yourself than to actually be an altruist, because being an altruist is actually costly. So why does this matter? Because if we go later on to Kim's talk, we will talk about charities, right? And charities have found out through experiments as well that many people try to avoid being asked for donations, right? And how did people find that out? Through an experiment. So there were researchers, and they were basically announcing times when they would come by and visit people's homes to ask for donations. And very, very surprisingly, people were not at home at these particular times, while they were at home at these unannounced times. Similar story if you collect, or there was an experiment of collecting charitable donations in front of a supermarket, and people suddenly switched basically the entrance they were using when they were seeing that there was a collection in front of one of the entrances. So that means that people try to avoid the ask because they know once they're being asked for a donation, they're very, very, very eager to look like an altruist, but they might not be actually an altruist because they're even more eager to avoid the situation where they have to give. So experiments like those ones can try to understand basically altruistic behavior, and by that try to help charities to design something that is called the perfect ask. So basically a strategy how they can make the most money. And Research Talk 3 by Kim Scharf will then tell you a little bit more about her own experiments on fundraising strategies. So that's the end of the interactive session. So we will conclude the whole event with 3 short research talks where we tell you a little bit more about how we do research with experiments and what we learn from this research. So the first person, or the first 2 persons to speak will be Rebecca and Danae, and they will have a conversation about experimental economics and COVID-19. So I might stop sharing my screen immediately so we can see you having this conversation, and I will also hide my video. And so you guys can go ahead.
Thanks, Hannes. Hi, everyone. Hi, Rebecca. Let's get started, shall we? So, Rebecca, you're an expert in problems that involve fatality risks. Why don't you tell everyone a bit more about how economists think about these issues?
Okay, so economics is sometimes known as the science of scarcity. So that means that economists tend to try to work out how to best use society's limited resources to best satisfy the unlimited things that we want, which could be anything from food security through to art or even music. So one crucial thing that people in society need is to be safe. But if we spent all of our resources making everybody as safe as we possibly could, then there'd be too little left over for other things like education that we might care about. On an individual level, we all make trade-offs in our daily lives all the time, don't we? For example, if we spent all of our money on a new TV, there'd be less left over to spend on holidays, if you can remember those at all. Economists actually care about trade-offs, both on an individual level, but also the trade-offs that society needs to make between safety and other things.
So how can economists help society to unpick these trade-offs?
Well, economists help partly by advising governments about this. So one key goal of policymaking is that policies ought to respect the preferences of members of the public. The trade-offs that governments make between different ways of using resources, which is essentially spending our money, including spending them on safety, should reflect the way that people on the street would like those trade-offs to be made.
And how can we know what trade-offs people would like governments to make? Because people don't usually make choices between different health treatments or, say, between health and education on a daily basis, do they?
Well, that's true, we don't. But to put it simply, we go out and we ask people. So we tend to do experiments that try to elicit what we call the value of a statistical life. So what that means is, how do people trade off their own wealth against their own safety? The idea is that the amount people are willing to pay for something reveals how valuable it is to them. So if I go to the shop and I pay £3 for a fancy loaf of bread, it's happened, it must have at least £3 worth of value to me. So the idea with safety is really just the same. We want to know how much people value reductions in their risks of dying. So we ask them questions that reveal how much they would be willing to pay for those risk reductions. By adding up these values across a very large and representative sample of the population, we can work out the value of preventing one death on average. So in the UK, this value is currently estimated to be around £1.9 million.
Are you saying my life is worth £1.9 million?
Of course not, absolutely not. So saving any individual's life when we know who is at risk is priceless. And our approaches are not applied to cases where there's an individual life at risk and we know whose life is at stake. Instead, the value of statistical life might be used, for example, in calculating in advance whether or not it's a good use of our resources to implement a road safety policy that would reduce the risk for many, many thousands of people, but each by a very small amount. So that on average, one extra person might be expected to survive, but we would never know whose life was the one that was saved. So essentially, we ask people about very small reductions, which when we aggregate them across a large number of people, sum to one life saved in expectation. So you get this value of statistical life by asking people essentially how they value their own risk reduction. But people don't only care about themselves, do they? What about their concern for other people?
I'm glad you asked. Standard economic theory is based on the assumption that people are completely self-interested and that they care only about their personal welfare. But of course, in reality, people do care about others, and they would prefer for societal resources such as healthcare, safety, education, etc., to be distributed fairly rather than to receive them all themselves.
Ah, interesting. So we've actually done some research on that, haven't we, in the context of fatality risks? Why don't you say a bit about that?
Sure. So what we did is asking people to choose between saving lives in different areas of an imaginary city. And by changing the descriptions of the risk reductions on offer and doing some statistical analysis, like you just did live, we found that people do like it when policies work in their own self-interest, but this was far from the only thing that mattered to them. Interestingly, we also showed that people are willing to make trade-offs. So they did prefer the more efficient allocations, that is the ones that save the most lives, but they were willing to give up some lives saved overall in order to spread the risk reduction more equally across the population.
So that sounds really relevant for the current pandemic.
It really is. The value statistical life is a really useful way to bring home the true cost of the pandemic. It's been an invaluable tool to help weigh up the different scenarios that could take place so that we can make trade-offs. But many economists think it's important to realize that in the long run, tackling this pandemic does not really involve a trade-off between protecting health and safety versus saving the economy. Instead, fighting the pandemic in the short term would actually be really beneficial to the economy in the long run. Of course, in the short term, there are really hard trade-offs between protecting jobs and industries and controlling the virus. And I don't envy policymakers who are having to decide how to balance this.
Yeah, me neither. But does your work on efficiency fairness trade-offs matter for the COVID pandemic too?
Yes. We think that understanding the way that people place on fairness against efficiency and how much emphasis they place on their own self-interest is really crucial. For one thing, it can help predict how people will react to policies like lockdown, where they have to bear a personal cost to protect other people. Also, it can help governments find out which policy options best respect public preferences. So the work we've been doing gives us lots of reasons to be optimistic about how people will react to difficult trade-offs. We are seeing a lot of impressive examples of this in our communities, where people are sacrificing personal benefits like seeing friends or going to the restaurant in order to make things easier for those that are more vulnerable. Now, I want to hear your opinion about something, Rebecca. Apart from the value of life, can economics experiments tell us anything about COVID-19?
Yeah, we can. So experiments in economics are really useful tools for basically working out how people's behavior will react to different changes in their environment. And we saw that in action in the interactive session just before. So one example is that experiments in economics have been used to show how people's behavior is influenced by what other people are doing. Basically, people like to follow the crowd, especially when they're in an uncertain situation. And we call these social norm effects.
Okay, and these are relevant for the pandemic too?
Well, I think one thing that's certain about this pandemic is that it's left everybody feeling uncertain about what they should do and how they should behave. A good example is the wearing of face masks. Early in the pandemic, there was quite a lot of variation, I think, in whether or not people wore them, and people tended to just sort of follow what others around them were doing. And the social norms in different parts of the country tended to emerge quite differently.
Right. Do you think this is why in China everyone was wearing them super early on? Because they already had the social norm of wearing a mask when they were ill, whereas here it took much, much longer because that was not the case at all.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable interpretation, yeah. Once the rules here became that it was mandatory to wear masks in shops, the norm did seem to shift, I think, and you saw more people wearing them. There's also some emerging evidence that some people wanted to wear a mask all along, but didn't do it before the rules came in because they didn't want to stand out as being different from the majority of people that they saw.
I guess that applies more broadly than just masks, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So societies had to quickly generate social norms around things like keeping 2 meters apart from each other, not meeting with people outside the household, and hand washing as well. Some companies have even tried to use social norms as part of their strategies to boost compliance with the COVID-19 guidance among their own workforces. But another really important area where experimental economics can be applied to this pandemic relates to information and to fake news. Can you tell us a bit about this?
Of course. So one of the things we have seen in the pandemic is how quickly rumors and fake news have spread. One example is a concern around 5G masts. Another notorious example is when Donald Trump suggested some dubious cures for COVID. People acted upon these comments in fairly large numbers, and this forced public health officials and doctors to issue warnings and clarify that there was no scientific evidence for this whatsoever. So one thing we know is that people are often not very good at judging the quality of information or at seeking information from good quality sources.
Right, so what does experimental economics tell us about all this?
Lots. There's a really interesting thread of research into what's known as motivated reasoning. Here, people are shown to seek out and to trust information that is likely to confirm what they already believe. For example, people who support a given political party might read papers that have the same political leanings as they do. It gets even more difficult. There's another phenomenon called cognitive dissonance, which describes the discomfort that we feel when we are confronted with evidence that disagrees with what we already think. So to avoid this discomfort, people will try to avoid information that goes against their beliefs.
Right, but surely that's always been the case.
Yes, but in the current information age, this is even more pronounced and potentially problematic. Why? We all have information from countless sources available to us at the touch of a button on our phones. But what we see in our news feeds is based on what we've seen and what we've liked and what we've engaged with. So this can lead to echo chambers where ideas and beliefs take root and get stronger just because they haven't been challenged.
But what have experimental economists found out about all this?
Experimental economics can help us understand how people choose between different sources of information. And we can use that, what we learn, to tackle misinformation. For example, in the lab, we can create artificial social groups and see how they share and consume information depending on their group identity. Also, depending on how we set up our experiments, we can even show how fake news can spread within groups. Back to you. Another related area that's closely linked to COVID-19 is information avoidance. And we touched on this idea in the charity experiment we did earlier, didn't we?
Yeah, that's right. So information avoidance is really quite common. Anytime you decide you'd rather not know something, or you feel like ignorance is bliss, for example, you're avoiding information. So that's a puzzle for economists because our models say that having more information is never worse than having less. Because if it's information that we don't need to use, then we can simply ignore it. But experimental economics and psychology tells us a completely different story. People have been found to avoid information about the way their actions affect others. For example, in the moral wiggle room studies, as we showed earlier, although our audience today don't seem so susceptible to that. People sometimes avoid learning the outcome of a test or an exam because they don't want to face the fact they might have failed. But they've also been shown to avoid information about their health. And in COVID-19, that's especially important. So if people don't want to know that they're ill, and they don't want to have to self-isolate either, then they may avoid getting tested and refuse to download the app as well. So we really need to understand information seeking and information avoidance if we want to make sure that the track and trace system is effective. That means understanding the psychology of it, as well as understanding the material consequences of having to self-isolate and addressing those as well.
This is such a fascinating area. You know, I could spend hours talking to you about it, but I think we only have a few minutes left. So back to the title of the event, Experiments for the Social Good. What other social good can come from this area?
Well, if we can understand how misinformation and disinformation are spread around society, then we can try to do something about it, as well as helping to understand why there are problems with information in society. As Hannes explained, experiments also offer us a chance to try out different potential solutions to the problems of things like echo chambers and fake news. Now, these solutions could include things like educating people to spot fake news by teaching them how to be skeptical on the internet, or it could involve working with social media outlets and their algorithms to help reduce the spread of information that's patently false. Experiments in the lab and in the field can help us to narrow down on the approaches that actually really work in practice. So of course, as economists, we won't be able to do this all on our own, and we'll be calling on our colleagues in computer science, psychology, even maths to help us. But I think this is a research agenda that has the potential to make a huge difference and really contribute to the social good.
Thank you. Thank you for this discussion. It's been a pleasure to talk to you about research.
I'm with you, yeah. Back to Hannes now to introduce our next talk.
All right, so thank you very much for this really, really nice conversation. I think we've learned lots about experimental economics and COVID-19 from it. So now I'll have to self-introduce me. So I'll give a short talk about can we cooperate to save the climate? And the first and most important question is, well, why would we want to save the climate, right? And this is a really nice paper that doesn't have to do anything with experimental economics, but with data science. And that's basically looking at the same place in the US over multiple years and seeing how basically annual temperature or daily temperature fluctuates in the same place and how it affects important outcome variables that we might care about. So that might be gross domestic product, so how much we can produce in a society. This might be mass test scores, or this might be social phenomena like criminal phenomena like rape. And what you can see, or what you should take from this, is that we sort of adapted very well to a specific temperature. And once we leave this point where we've adapted well to, then bad things tend to happen, right? So you can see from this first graph, our temperature optimum for being productive is around 15 to 20 degrees. And if you go very much to the left or very much to the right, then quickly we become less productive. The same thing applies to cognitive productivity. If you look at these mass test scores, then you can see how they slowly drop off once we get in these very warm temperatures, while you can also see that once these temperature anomalies increase, we see more criminal activity. And you can do that with many other things as well. You can look at agricultural yields, you can look at other outcome variables, and you can see that we are very much adapted to a specific temperature range. And climate change, obviously, the problem is that we might be leaving this temperature range and we're not well adapted to, and that might be costly to adapt to this new temperature range, or that we might simply be less productive if we can't adapt. The next question then becomes how to think about climate change. And I think about climate change as a cooperation problem foremost. And why is that? Well, everyone emits greenhouse gas emissions with almost all daily activities. There's hardly anything you can do that doesn't emit some kind of greenhouse gas emissions. But to prevent climate change, emissions of everyone have to be cut by a very significant amount. And just to put this into perspective, if you think about the last year, we did all these corona lockdowns throughout the world where people basically were changing their lifestyles dramatically. And this dramatic change of lifestyles, all it did to carbon emissions was cutting them by 8.8% globally in this first half of 2020. And this is a very small amount if you can consider how much your lives have changed. And if you wanted to cut them by 50% or 80%, which is actually what you will have to do something about climate change in the long run, then you would have to do much more dramatic things than we did in the first half of 2020, with the current technology we have, of course. So what this means is that the personal cost of cutting emissions are currently very, very large. If you think about the aggregate benefits, the problem is that they might be also very, very large, right? And one way to think about this in slightly technical terms is that these aggregate benefits are an infinite sum of current and future benefits over 8 to 10 billion people. So even if the benefits for each of these individuals are actually not that large, the thing is that these benefits stretch very, very far in the future and affect very many people. And so this aggregate sum of benefits of avoiding climate change might actually be quite large. So the problem now arises from this third bullet point, that the individual benefits from cutting your own emissions are probably quite low. And most likely they're lower than the cost. And that means each single individual doesn't have any kind of incentive to cut their own emissions dramatically. And then think about this in the following way. Imagine you yourself starts cutting emissions dramatically in your own life and nobody else does. This will not do anything to climate change. You will have to change your life quite dramatically, but there will be no benefits from it whatsoever. So how could we coordinate all these individuals to still contribute to climate change to reap these aggregate benefits? Well, we would have to have an institution. And here the problem comes in that there is no international institution that can do that for us. So there is no institution that can enforce within different countries that people basically change their lives. And the prediction that comes from simple economics is, well, we should see significant free riding on the efforts of others and basically nobody doing anything about climate change. There's a couple of extra problems that come in with climate change that make it a particularly hard problem. And it has been called the perfect moral storm or the mother of externalities. And why is that? So first of all, it's the long time gap between things. So the emissions we're producing today will reach 200 years into the future. And that's what this talk will be about a little bit, right? So can we actually cooperate for people that live very far off of the future that we're not going to meet in person, right? And that's the climate change problem. The other thing is that these costs and benefits are very unequally distributed. And the problem is that basically the costs are concentrated in the rich countries. The rich countries are the countries that are emitting a lot of CO2, while the benefits are quite concentrated in the poorer countries. So if you think about sub-Saharan Africa, this is a place where there will be a lot of climate change damages. And if you look at the policy discussion, it's all about past responsibilities versus current emissions. And the last thing is uncertainty. And uncertainty is hardly ever good. And the problem with uncertainty, you can look at this little picture, you see this big confidence spans, meaning we don't really know how these emission scenarios will play out yet. The biggest problem with these uncertainties is that there's the possibility of very large tail risks. So you could think about climate change policies actually as an insurance policy against these tail risks that we don't yet know anything about. However, uncertainty obviously on a behavioral level let people get a little bit complacent, right? So you don't want to imagine these really bad outcomes, and it's very comfortable to be complacent about your own behavior. So here I just want to give you a very quick classification of important cooperation problems. The first problem is called the hunting a mammoth problem. So hunting a mammoth is where our cooperative institutions, our cooperative behavior actually evolved. If you go back 30,000 years in time, we were living in small groups and tribes. We repeatedly interacted with each other. We could communicate because there were only 30 people in my tribe. Most of them were my relatives. And so we evolved as super cooperative. We are really cooperative species. And how do we maintain cooperation in these small group settings where we talk to each other, we communicate, we engage in reciprocity? So reciprocity simply means I'm going to be nice to you because you've been nice to me in the past. Or I've observed you being nice to somebody else, and so I'm going to be nice to you, right? And this is how reciprocity can work in small groups because everybody can observe everyone. And then I can start sanctioning people who don't play by the rules. And I can build very strong group norms. I have an in-group, right? And this in-group I want to help. And this is how we are super cooperators as a species. But now we live in modern times, and now we live in large groups. We meet a lot of strangers. We might only meet once. There's little communication between us. And if you think about stopping a pandemic, well, there are many people in the UK or globally I will never interact with. And still I have to rely on their cooperation in a sense if you want to stop the spread of a virus, right? As long as we stay in the nation state, this is going to be all right, because within a nation state, we have basically built institutions that replace these small group settings, right? We have taxes, we have laws, we have a police force, and they can actually, help us enforce these norms. Well, now we go to the actual problem we want to talk about, stopping climate change. Now we talk about everybody at the globe, and we talk about strangers in the future, right? It's not only that people are strangers, but they're not even born yet. So we are trying to cooperate for the benefit of people who live in the future. We can't ever communicate with them. There's no institutions of these future people being able to interact with us, and there's no enforceable institutions globally. And that raises a very fundamental question. The fundamental question that I'm trying to answer in my research is, are we even psychologically able to use these mechanisms we know from these small group settings and apply them to a problem where we have to cooperate for the sake of strangers living in the future? So if you think back about this little experiment you did at the beginning of this interactive session, so this is a perfect example of a small group setting of cooperation, right? And we were seeing that you were quite good at cooperating with each other in this thing. So this is a single generation dilemma. All the 4 people of you are in the same group. And if this person in the left-hand corner cooperates, then all the other 3 people will benefit from his cooperation, and the other way around. And this setting makes direct reciprocity possible if you interact more than once, right? If you interact a second time or a third time, which we haven't done in this interactive setting, then you can actually respond to what other people have been doing. And that's the standard setting, how people have been studying cooperation in economics for quite a long time. And the interesting pattern is basically here on the right side. So what you can see in this interesting pattern is that, like yourself, most people start somewhere halfway between being fully cooperative and basically being not cooperative at all. And then if you repeat this setting over 10 rounds, here you see periods going from 1 to 10, then you see how cooperation slowly declines. And it already says here something without punishment. So why does this slowly decline? Because you will have a mix of types in there. You will have selfish types, you will have unconditionally cooperative types, and then you will have conditionally cooperative types. So a conditionally cooperative type is a reciprocator, and he will observe what happens in this group. And if he observes somebody basically defecting, not contributing to this public good, he will also not contribute. And then this basically self-enforces, and everything drops back to 0 without punishment. And now a lot of the research in experimental economics has looked at a setting where we introduce punishment. So imagine that instead of reducing contributions, there's a second thing that people can do. They can basically punish defectors. And that has an immediate effect here, right? It recreates this small group setting that I've been talking about. You can punish other people. Punishment simply means in this experiment that you can take away a little bit of the money they're earning in this experiment. And suddenly cooperation rises up to 100% and stays there. And the big conclusion from this whole thing is that humans are very able to engage in something which is called altruistic punishment. Why is it altruistic? Because punishment in these experiments is a little bit costly. So if you want to punish somebody else, you carry a cost, but humans are actually willing to carry this cost. How is this basically happening? Well, you've measured emotions of these people. These are strongly negative towards non-cooperators, and they're so negative that people are actually willing to not cooperate then. So the question is, does this work for climate change? So we have Greta Thunberg over here on the right side, and she's saying a thing like, I will never forgive you if you choose to fail us, right? So this is a threat of punishing other people maybe, right? But not forgiving them. So punishment is not only monetary punishment. Punishment can basically be any kind of, social ostracism. And you can see how Donald Trump might not care. Okay, so let me quickly talk you through this little experiment I did. So here is a cooperation game where we basically look at this first group, and this first group has to cooperate for the benefit of the second group. And how does this work? You have these 3 people, they get 10 euros. They have to put them into a pot. If they reach more than 15, then this next generation actually gets to make a choice. Otherwise, this chain breaks down. This is set up as a cooperation experiment in the sense that it's always better for this later group if these earlier groups cooperate, but they themselves do not really benefit from cooperation. So does punishment do anything to this. And the bad news is not really, right? So what you can see in this graph is basically a comparison between some groups that had no punishment and some groups that had punishment. And you can see how cooperation quickly declines in these black bars, but it also quickly declines in these gray bars. So what we find in this research really is that punishment, even though it's really helpful in these small groups, doesn't really do a lot in these large groups. So the take-home messages here are voluntary cooperation is really difficult. We learn to cooperate within small groups for the sake of our fellow group members, and that's very distinct from the climate problem. So cooperation for the sake of abstract strangers in the future is much more difficult. So in easy terms, shaming your flatmate into becoming a vegan is only going to work some of the time. So I think cutting this talk a little bit short, I had a few more take-home messages, but I think I'll pass on to Kim to finish off the event. So thanks very much for listening to this part, and then moving on to Kim's part, who will share her own screen.
I'm just getting my screen share going here. One sec. Can everybody see that? So this is can you see the screen?
Yep, thanks, Kim.
Okay, great. That's good. This is a bit of a change of tack, but it's also an important area of research that has to actually utilize experiments because there's simply no other data available. And it's actually about efficiency and competition in the nonprofit sector. So it's a bit different from the kinds of things that Rebecca, Danae, and Johannes have been talking about so far, but give you a bit of a flavor about a kind of question that economists would like to ask about whether donors are behaving rationally and charities are behaving rationally in their fundraising video efforts, but that we can't actually answer with using traditional data sources. It just doesn't exist. They just don't exist. So the title is called Fixed Costs and Efficiency in the Nonprofit Sector, and it sounds quite technical. And the first two slides might not alleviate your concerns in that regard. The main question here is, are donors afraid of charities' fixed costs? Now, before talking about this question a bit more and why I'm interested in it, I'll just give you a brief overview of what fixed costs actually are. Fixed costs are costs that do not scale up with output. They're things like computers, lab space, you have to rent a big building, and then every time you add somebody, you don't actually have to rent another new building. Variable costs are costs that don't scale up with output. Now, for the economists in the room, the picture that we can draw to capture the difference between fixed costs and variable costs is this one. This blue line here just says that as we increase the amount of output, our average costs fall. So when you incur fixed costs, what you're doing is you're capturing scale economies. You're incurring a cost up front, and then every time you produce an extra unit, you experience an average a fall in your average cost. A variable cost is just something that stays flat. So every time you produce an extra unit, you just incur the same costs. Now, I was trying to think about how to motivate this and also relate it to COVID. And I thought I'd share with you my artistic talents, which probably explain why I became an economist more than anything else. If we think about vaccinations, and then we think about COVID, obviously, because that's the first thing that comes to mind. At some point, the British government's going to have to deliver, well, millions and millions of vaccinations to the UK population. And charities in Africa also deliver vaccinations to villages to protect them against disease. There are two ways of delivering vaccinations. You can buy a large SUV here and incur a fixed cost up front of the price of the car. And you can load it up with vaccinations. So you can get 500 vaccinations into that SUV, drive it to the village or to the town or to the city once, and then vaccinate everybody. So sure, you have to pay a big cost up front, but then the average cost is falling and you can get 500, you get 500 vaccinations for a price that's actually less in total, for a total cost that's less than if you had to hire 500 camels, 500 camel handlers, and put 1 vaccination on each camel. This would be a method of delivering vaccinations by camel that would incur no fixed costs, because every vaccination that you deliver has to have 1 camel and 1 person, and the cost then of delivering an additional vaccine is constant. There's no argument in any book anywhere that this Land Rover or big SUV method is more efficient than hiring camels. So there's no reason for people to be afraid of fixed costs. Indeed, in private markets, capturing these scale economies doesn't actually prevent any challenges, and the most cost-effective technology, if private manufacturers and private firms don't incur fixed costs, if they don't hire the SUV and take advantage of the most cost-effective technology, they'll be driven out of business because they won't be able to offer goods at the lowest price. So in the private marketplace, competition actually ensures that the most effective technology is chosen by private firms in the private marketplace. So private markets don't see a problem with capturing scale economies and incurring fixed costs in their business. As a matter of fact, if they didn't do it, they wouldn't be in business. Now, this is where I actually started wondering about the question of whether charities behave the same as private markets. And the reason I started wondering about this is that even though people kind of like to think of charitable goods and services as the same kinds of things that, as the same kind of goods and services that the private market sells, they're not. The price mechanism doesn't work. You can't actually put a price on the social value that charities produce of their goods and services. If you could, they would just be private goods and you could sell them in the private marketplace. So a long-standing interest and question of mine is, should we treat the charitable sector in terms of competition outcomes that prevail in the private sector? Should we just sort of map those onto the nonprofit sector and say competition is a good thing in the nonprofit sector because it's a good thing in the private sector? Well, I mean, I'm not sure. And as this study shows, actually competition is very harmful in the nonprofit sector. And the nonprofit sector includes things like education, some health services, and any kind of public goods and services that are provided by the more than 180,000 registered charities in the UK. Now, remember, in the private sector, we want to incur fixed costs, we want to capture scale economies, we want to be efficient. In the nonprofit sector, even though charitable goods and services can't be bought and sold as they are in private markets, charities of all sizes should still incur fixed costs and actually have efficient production processes. Do they? Well, the idea of cost effectiveness and fixed costs actually seems to present special challenges to charities. You just have to go to any charity website and you'll see fundraising techniques that start out saying something like, we're a charity, we produce goods and services, and we don't incur any fixed costs in what we produce. All of your donation will go to program costs. All of your donations will go to the, as I was saying, in quote unquote, the camel, the vaccine, and the camel handler. This seems really, really strange for economists who would be worried about efficiency and would wonder why being a charity would mean that you would start to adopt inefficient production techniques. So we see that charities do seem to relate to fixed costs differently than do private firms. And it's going to matter because it's going to result in an inefficient use of resources. We could take all the resources, reallocate them in a way, and get more for the same money. So charities worry about how fixed costs affect their position. And if you look at charity websites, you also see this this kind of concern reinforced. There's the Charity Satellite, all these places online that rank charities according to their effectiveness, actually rank charities that don't spend money on fixed costs, that don't incur fixed costs, much higher than charities that do. So the ones that come out with the worst scores are all things like laboratories, health, research and development, all of the kinds of charitable goods and services that add huge value to society, but that do require the incurring of fixed costs. So if donors are looking at these charity web pages and satellite sites, and charities are also encouraging donors to believe they don't have fixed costs and that they're bad, there are real implications for efficiency. Donors will make choices based on whether charities incur fixed costs or not, and those choices will be inefficient. If we think that a good charity has a small fraction of fixed costs relative to variable costs, and fixed costs are thought of as being wasteful, and variable costs are interpreted as measuring actual program activity, it just doesn't make any sense. It's exactly like saying that any money spent on research and development is wasteful. If we look at the picture on the left, we can see a guy starting a fire with a stick and a string, and you got to kind of rub the string back and forth on the stick until you get a flame. It's an innovation relative to having lightning strike the forest, but the way of thinking about fixed costs as being something that's wasteful would suggest that that's a wasteful method of producing fire, and that matches are even more wasteful. So if donors buy into this notion that fixed costs are a bad thing, then we wind up with a charitable sector that's inefficient, that is actually not being innovative, and that may even adopt inefficient technologies because they think donors won't like fixed costs. So there's an efficiency-based economic rationale here for government intervention targeted towards fixed costs if we find that donors don't like them and that there is, in fact, these innovation slowdowns in the sector as a result of charities' fears of fixed costs. That's the question we wanted to address. Now, why did we, what did we do? We used experiments to answer the question. So the method, just to give you a real flavor, because I know we're almost out of time, is that we can't use data from other sources. So the only thing that we could do to test our ideas here was experiments in the lab. And what we did, we started with an hypothesis based on just standard economic theory, where we went, well, donors will avoid large fixed costs if they think the charities with them won't be able to cover their fixed costs. If they can't cover their fixed costs, they won't be able to provide anything. So in some sense, donors might think that charities with large fixed costs are actually riskier than charities with small fixed costs. It's not that they're afraid of fixed costs, it's they're afraid that other donors won't coordinate their donations on the more efficient charities. So we tested this hypothesis in the lab and sort of asked the question, well, how do donors coordinate on the most efficient charity? And the lab experiment looked a bit like this. We gave participants a choice of making a contribution to one of the four scenarios where everybody contributed to, say, the green charity, 3 people, and everybody, you could choose to be contribute to the top circle. And if you did that, you would get sort of a big payoff of 400 on the right, or you might want to choose green when there are 2 out of 3 are green, or 1 out of 3, or no green. And we made very clear the mapping here between the effect that other donors have on the ultimate payoff and the cost really of not actually being able to cover the fixed costs. So what we're able to do is actually test the causal relationship between donors' thoughts about whether they could coordinate with other donors in a way that would allow the high cost, more efficient charity to actually wind up producing stuff. And our results what we found was that under full coordination, so if all donors contributed to the most efficient charity, the payoff, the amount of money that the charity could deliver, or the amount of goods and services, the value of those goods and services would be 177% more than just sort of throwing a dice. So full coordination would lead to a much, much higher payoff than not. But in the experiments, groups only got a payoff that's 58% higher than that, what they would be able to get from throwing a dice. They didn't choose the best outcome, and they didn't choose the best outcome because they viewed that outcome as being risky, even though they knew it was a better outcome. If we actually took away some of the choices, we would still get an increase in payoffs rather than actually leaving it in. So we could actually take stuff away from the choice set, and donors would actually improve on the outcome that they faced when they had available all the choices and all the information about fixed costs and payoffs associated with them. Even if we took away the best choice, we'd still get 66% higher payoff. What this sounds like just a lot of numbers, but what this means is that there's all of this evidence suggests that charities have an incentive to adopt inefficient technologies because they view their survivability in the charitable sector as more likely if they have an inefficient technology. And that means that there's a waste of resources to society, and that just fundamentally violates the kind of thing that economists are interested in, which is economic efficiency and the best allocation of resources. Now, I've rushed through this. I'm very happy if anybody wants to send me an email to talk more about why experiments have mattered here and how I've used them for the social good, because what I've shown in this research is that there is a role for government to step in and stop and actually start to possibly cover the fixed costs of charities so that charities don't have to pretend that they don't incur them and are incentivized to adopt more effective technologies. The big point, the other big takeaway is that competition is harmful in the charitable sector. And I know we keep hearing about competition in charitable sector, nonprofit sector as being something good. It is not true. Challenge it next time somebody says that to you, whoever it is that says it to you. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my screen now. And I think we've got time for a couple of questions.
All right, so thank you very much, everybody. So if you want to use the Q&A tool to type in some questions, we can look at them. So I think there's a question for you, Kim, by Luke.
My audio. It says, do you feel the decisions made by donors with regard to fixed and variable cost funding would translate to investments in corporate sustainability when considering RevX CapEx expenditure? What revenue expenditure, capital expenditure? Yeah, well, it should apply. Now, investments in corporate sustainability, are we talking about kind of private like we're talking about private markets or public markets, right? So when we make an investment, we're expecting to get a return on that investment in the private sector. When we make an investment in corporate sustainability, it's not clear what we want that return to be and whether that's just an issue for the shareholders. You know, we could invest in sustainability in order to enhance the value of the corporation, or we can do it just because we want to do good. In any case, every organization, whether they're in the private sector, in the nonprofit sector, or in the government sector, should be using the most efficient production technology that they have available to them. And if they're not, that would actually completely violate our notion about what a rational agent is. And we would actually want to understand more about the reasons why.
Yes, so I think there's a second question for you, Kim, in the chat, however.
What is that? Let's see. Hopefully, Hannes can. Oh, no, sorry.
Yeah.
Where's that one?
So you have to open the chat. I can
you read it to me?
Shall I read it to you? So,
Yeah.
so Tim is asking, is the perception not due to technologies applied, but a concern about costs incurred by employing staff? Personally, I'd want to give to a charity that innovates in its technology, but employs minimal staff. So is it staff cost or fixed cost, basically?
Yeah, that's right. So the experiments that we did were directly related to the kinds of fixed costs that result in declining average costs. There was no way of misinterpreting, because of the structure of the experiment and the mapping that we did between the parameters representing these kind of fixed costs that lowered average costs of production and the choices that donors made. There was no way for donors to misinterpret what these fixed costs were about. There are other concerns that we haven't looked at, and they are kind of added on concerns, which is maybe donors are also concerned about fancy dinners for the board of trustees, and they don't want their donations going to that. They might be thinking that fixed costs or core costs consist of those as well. So there's sort of two dimensions here. Our study completely isolated fixed costs as being fixed costs that added to the productivity of the charity and that made the pound donation going into the charity more effective. There are other costs, though, that donors are also worried about, and these could just simply exacerbate our findings and result in even more inefficiency in the charity. I think charities have a lot of work to do to educate donors about what fixed costs are good fixed costs and which ones are bad fixed costs. So how do I explain that low-income people tend to donate more of their resources in comparison to richer donors? I can't explain that. It's a finding that's, that holds very strong across all developed countries. And I think there's a lot of work to be done on this question. Likewise, so rich donors tend to donate less than 1% of their income to charities, and poor donors donate about 2.5% of their income to charities. Rich donors give more to the charitable sector simply because they have a lot more money. So this is an interesting question. We don't know the answer to this question. People are working on it, and I'm also working on this issue about inequality across the sector and across types of donors and heterogeneity in donors. And another very interesting question that hasn't been answered appropriately and that we might want to use experiments for in the future is also whether if donors start out poor and they become rich, do they become stingier or more generous? So that people don't just stay at one place in the income distribution. If they move up the income distribution, do their attitudes and kind of contributions actually change?
All right, so I've got one last question maybe from Tim in the chat. So the question was about the climate change talk. So how about when the future generations aren't abstract strangers, but are actually our own children? Aren't we more likely to invest in the future when we consider that this is our own children? So this is a very good question in the sense that that this is a question we're at the moment tackling with an experiment where we want to look at this setting where generations start to overlap again. And you rightly assume that this opens up a little bit more possibilities for cooperation, because you can actually have some interactions between the involved parties more easily. And so in a strategic sense, it makes sense that in such a setting, cooperation might be a little bit easier to maintain. And obviously, we might also feel much more moral obligation towards our own children. The problem with climate change, however, is that it doesn't only affect our own children, but it goes much further into the future, and there will be generations affected that don't have any overlap with ourselves, and then we are back to the setting that we've been studying. So I think it looks a little bit more positive in that way, but we still should be a little bit careful that cooperation would simply not be easy in this setting. Okay, so if there's no further questions, or we've answered all questions, I think I'd like to conclude the event, given that we've already run a little bit over time. So thank you everyone for participating in this event. It was great to have you all here. Thank you for participating in the online experiments. I hope you took a little bit from it and understand now a little bit better how experiments work in economics, and that they're a great tool for studying problems for the social good. Also remember that there are other great events in the Festival of Social Science. So if you go to the link, you will have the possibility to look at the whole program and basically understand a little bit more about many other interesting research questions that we are tackling at the Department of Economics and at the College of Social Sciences. So thank you very much, and have a nice evening, I guess.